All right, so we already did the introductory slide of please introduce yourself. And I forgot to do our activity of you're from Ohio but let's bypass that and get into today's presentation. Keith?
Thanks, Jen. So hi, my name's Keith Instone. I want to tell you a little bit about one of the organizers of the event, Ohio X, and then we partnered with UX Akron on that. Ohio X is a nonprofit membership association that's connecting, promoting, and advocating for tech in Ohio. So one of their catchphrases is, let's make Ohio a tech hub. The UX Roundtable is a part of that, where we're connecting UX professionals across the state. There's already lots of UX communities like in Akron and Cincinnati and Columbus that are connecting locally. So we're trying to connect across the state. And then we're also doing things like this webinar to help tell stories about what's happening about user experience across Ohio. We meet on a monthly basis to just hang out and chat with each other. And we also have working teams around raising career awareness, improving professionalization, and increasing organizational capability. So we're, once a month we get together and hang out, and then we do little projects. So like in September is going to be the Ohio Tech Day, where all across Ohio, we're trying to raise awareness of tech careers for the K through 12 audience. And as part of that, then we use that to help raise awareness of UX jobs, UX careers. So I'm Keith, and Joshua Randall's one of my partners in it. And Josh will be introducing the authors later on. But Melanie or Jennifer, who wants to tell us a little bit about UX Akron, who's our partner with this particular webinar?
I know Melanie is on the line, and if she wants to jump in, but I'm not sure if she can. Melanie is our president of UX Akron. UX Akron is based out of Akron, but we are recruiting and of course are interested in anyone interested in UX. We do a lot of social meetups. We host speakers. And we are also helping or assisting with World IA Day, which is coming up on March 4th, Saturday. It's going to be at the Akron Main Library. And you can find us at the WordPress, uxakron.com. And I'm trying to think what else in the meantime, if Melanie wants to jump in and chat and add anything more. But that is UX Akron.
I think Melanie's not actually a panelist, so she cannot
I'm
currently
trying
speak.
to I'll elevate her, so I thought I could. Let me see if I can. All right. If not, for the sake of time, let's get into the introduction of today's authors. And I thank them for being here. Josh, you have the slide.
All right. I am very happy to introduce our authors, Marc Majers, Laura Leventhal, and Marty Gage and Spencer Murrell. Or Murrell. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
Murrell like squirrel.
Okay. I will go ahead and read the intros here. So starting with Marc Majers, he is an accomplished user experience leader, a published author, and an adjunct professor with 20 plus years of experience improving things for websites, software, and applications. His latest book is Make Your Customers Dance. The key to user experience is knowing your audience. And he says the goal of the book is to discover how to perform user-centered design, what user experience means, and where to start. Marc is a certified UX analyst, a certified professional in accessibility core competencies, and has a master's degree from Kent State U's User Experience Design program. You can catch him as the host of the podcast series UX Pathways, where guests discuss how they got into UX and how you can too. And you can also learn more about Marc at his website, marc.com. Our next author is Laura Leventhal, PhD, who's a part-time professor in the computer science department at the University of Findlay and an emeritus professor of computer science at Bowling Green. Her PhD is from the University of Michigan, but even though this is Ohio X, we still love her. Dr. Leventhal is the author of numerous articles in the areas of user experience and user experience education. She's also the co-author of the text usability engineering, process, products, and examples. Dr. Leventhal's primary research interests, in addition to UX education, include the impact of information representations on spatial cognition in complex virtual environments. And finally, we have Marty Gage, a generative research pioneer, serial entrepreneur, and LexTent's VP of Design Research. He leads a team that defines people's desired experiences, and his research has produced business value for leading brands, including Procter & Gamble, Kohler, Microsoft, HP, Dell, and a very long list of amazing companies that are amazing. We also have Spencer Murrell, the VP of Insight Translation, and he and his team play a pivotal role in the design research process at precisely the moment that it matters most, when research findings are synthesized. His methods have provided design direction and common language for numerous leading brands, including Honda, GM, GSK, Samsung, and many, many others. Thank you so much to all of our authors for being here.
For having us.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to stop the screen share so we can focus on our authors. Let's start by asking if you could do a sales pitch, a quick sales pitch on your book, because you all come from 3 different, I want to say, audiences. So if we'll start with Marty, and if you want to give a sales pitch, tell us a little bit about your book.
Well, the book, I guess the story, here's the book. It's not your typical book. There's one reference, lots of pictures, and the whole thing was written top of mind. Took 30 years to write because it's based on 30 years of trial and error working with Spencer. I'm a human factors psychologist. He's an industrial designer. Figuring out how to do upfront research to inform and inspire the design process. I'll let Spencer say what he wants.
You know, I graduated from design school 40 years ago, over 40 years ago now. And our professors used to tell us that half of every new product introduction fails in the marketplace. And, you know, 41 years later, that's still true. And there's got to be a better way to ensure that the things you make resonate with the target. And that's what Marty and I have been trying to figure out for 30 years.
So it took 30 years to write the book.
That's amazing. Laura, tell us about yours, because I think you're also on the other end of the spectrum.
Okay, here's mine. My copy doesn't have coffee on it. Jen's copy has coffee on it. I have, for my whole career, I've been a computer science professor, and we feel like that computer scientists obviously are also builders of things, and one of the things that they oftentimes build are user experiences, whether they're trained to do it or not. And so about at the early part of my career in the 80s, we were already teaching, we called it at that point HCI, of course, but we were already teaching HCI concepts and development approaches to undergraduates and graduate students. My book is for undergrads, but SIGCHI, our one of our professional societies for computer human interaction, came up with a list of requirements and curriculum for HCI for computer scientists in the 1993. So we've been teaching it, and my audience obviously is for undergrads. And our focus really, this is what, I mean, my students come back and they say this to me just to make me laugh. The first day of school or class, I always say, whether you're building a user experience or a washing machine, you still are going to go through a series of steps, and you're going to use tools. And if we don't understand what those steps are, we're still going to go through the steps. We just might not do a very good job of it. So we try to teach the students about the process and the steps that they would go through under different circumstances to achieve success.
All right. And Mark, I'm going to a wedding tomorrow, Mark, so I'm going to be thinking of you, but go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, so my book is behind me, but what was interesting is this is my second book. The first one I wrote was almost 20 years ago, and I wrote it when I was an adjunct teaching web design class. And it was because a lot of the books that were created were not addressing that user research that understanding the audience needs to be baked into the web design process. So if you remember 20 years ago was more of the waterfall approach, the big front design. So I had written it as more of a checklist, as a counterpart to a checklist, so that as a student, you could easily understand that you can't skip this process. Then what happened is about 10 years after that, I started thinking about, is there another way to explain this? And what keeps happening as we see is that research or understanding the end user always seems to be left out of the process, or it's at the end of the process. Maybe we can A/B test it. Maybe we can just see what happens out in the wild, and started realizing that that is not the best step to take. You should be gathering some feedback. So I started thinking, what is an easy way to have an analogy to that? And I realized, well, wait a minute, my friend told me, and I opened the story in this book, that my friend told me to pull over to the side of the road, that I've been a designer during the day, and then on the weekends, I've been a wedding DJ, and it's actually the same exact thing. And I was like, well, what are you talking about? And it's really about, if you think about it, if you've ever been to a wedding reception, if you see a DJ and there's nobody dancing, you immediately think they're not doing a good job. But if the floor is packed, they're doing a great job. It's the same thing with your website, your application, everything you're creating. If there is an audience and you can visibly see there is an audience there, we're all tracking it with our business metrics, then something is happening that's allowing someone to enjoy your product. So this book was all about trying to understand that the same techniques that I'm using to control a dance floor are the same things that are being used by marketers, by developers, by designers to keep people engaged with your product. The original title of the book was called, I think, Your Website or Your App is a Dance Floor, but it made more sense that it's make your customers dance. It's really the key to user experience is understanding your audience. If you are not spending time understanding your audience, then there is no way you ever will have a competitive or successful, pleasant, efficient product, because they'll go somewhere else. They'll go to another product. And it's the same thing. I've done wedding receptions where they've done a conga line into the other room and they're gone. I'm like, wait a minute, I'm not going to do that again. So there's a lot of things that we learn as we're building these applications that I think the same techniques that are using, you're doing research techniques when you're building an application, you're doing research techniques before a wedding reception as an entertainer. There's a lot of crossover between the two, and that's what the book is about, how you can apply that. And it's in a way that allows you to understand this topic, because we've all been to wedding receptions. As you're saying, you're going to one this weekend. So keep an eye out of the techniques that are being used.
Yes. And Laura, you hit on this, about your audience. And I was just wondering, Marty and Spencer, who is the audience of your book, or who did you intend to write for? And I'm just interested in, is it different? Are you finding that the audience is different than what you intended, or was it spot on? Or
Well, it was written, the book outlines the way we work here in Lexington. So that the audience by default there is practitioners. But we had to write the book because we've been teaching out at the Savannah College of Art and Design for the last 20 years. And the dean took us out to lunch and said, hey, I've got a certification in Adobe. I've got a certification in 3D modeling. I need a certification in upfront user research. Would you help me do it? So we did it. And the professor that started teaching it came to our office, and we worked with her and helped her modify her curriculum, showed her how we work. She started changing the class, modifying the class. And then we realized we needed a book to support the certification. So we wrote the book to support the certification. So it's being used by students, but it's also for practitioners as well. It's just, I think the great advantage was having to squeeze it into 10 weeks. It forced us to just pick the most important stuff. And it was written and then it was tested before it was published and modified. So the book's been basically usability tested, which I think kind of worked out well for us. We got feedback on it before we published it. What would you say, Spencer?
I would say we're accidental authors. You know, we were doing a favor for a friend out at SCAD. And by the time we were finished telling them everything we know, it was the size of a book. And we sent it to Wiley and they said, oh, sure, we'll publish it. So we never intended to write a book. We just intended to support, the SCAD curriculum. So kind of weird.
And Mark, what about you? Your intended audience, was it students or was it the general practitioner? Both? I mean, I read it. So who's your audience and did it align with who you thought?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the name of the book is Understand Your Audience. So the goal of the book was create a common ground so that the beginner, someone that doesn't really understand what user experience is, they're trying to get into the market. There's been a lot of shifting around with this term, user experience. And the essential goal was that individual that is looking either to get into it or they're trying to understand what this is all about, so that you can reference this analogy, because you've probably been a part of a wedding reception or you witnessed one. And then maybe the next one you go to, you start seeing, well, wait a minute, they're using that technique and that technique. Maybe I can use that as well when I'm actually creating a product or an environment or a system, whatever you're doing. So it was geared toward that beginner, whether you're a developer, a designer, a product owner, that range. However, there are some advanced techniques as you begin, even if you're in that role, it could help you possibly hone or make yourself a little more skilled in a particular area.
And I would say, Laura, I think yours is hitting the demographic, as I was showing everyone earlier in academic realm. Someone I think was up in a study carrel and just doused it with coffee. So I think you're hitting your target audience of students. So Laura, have you found that even though yours was written more on an academic, are you finding a diverse audience, different fields, anything you wish to add?
Well, I think the answer to that is probably yes, but maybe not to the extent of the other books. So my co-author, Julie Barnes, and I also were teaching software engineering and some other, basically when you're a computer science professor, you teach everything. And so we actually, I think, were able certainly to reach out not only to those students, but to bring in to the book, and certainly in the way we were teaching, to bring in those other areas of computer science, particularly software engineering, to try to connect with that. And I definitely believe we've certainly had a connection with that. So I think yes, but again, probably not to the extent of these other two, because that wasn't really our target.
Now, my next question, originally I was going to ask, what was your aha moment when you realized I must write that? And Marty and Spencer, you hit on yours about the dean came to you. Mark, you were pulled aside and someone said, you're a DJ. And Laura, you had this, well, I needed to write it for the curriculum. Let's talk about the actual writing process, because as a librarian, I find it very daunting. So how did you start your research once you had that moment, that ask from the dean or that aha moment? How did you start your research? I know I have the problem. When do you know when enough is enough? How do you finish? How do you say, I need to stop going down the rabbit hole? Otherwise, this will turn into, the Britannica. So just if you have any thoughts, like tell us about the whole process of writing. What was that like? Let's see, Mark, I'll have you go first.
Sure. So I had indicated earlier that I had an opportunity to write my first book, and I realized that after that experience that I was going to approach it differently this round. So the way I'd approach it this way, it was interesting because if you write and you're a writer, you can start using electronic means, and every time you're writing, it's going to scream at you and say, that's a misspell, or it underlines it in red. So I actually started on paper, which I know is probably not the most eco-friendly, but I did have some little pocketbooks that I just started writing down some ideas. And I said, well, okay, so if my friend is telling me there's this such parallel, what is the parallel? So I started writing down, okay, for example, when the dance floor is empty, what are the techniques that I use to bring someone out? One of the techniques is in the book Influence, which is called social proof, which is if there's more than 2 or 3 couples out there on the dance floor, it's more inclined that you're going to join. Well, the same thing happens in web design or in application design. Oh, there's reviews of the book. Well, someone else reviewed it. Maybe I should buy it too. So I started looking at what are the parallels between the two. And that's where I first started. I started writing down what are those from that idea. But I started on paper. And then I also started talking to myself, which may look strange, but I see a lot of people doing it, of just while I'm walking and maybe I get an idea and I'll just started getting down these ideas. That was maybe about year 1 or year 2. We talked about how long the process was. It took me about 9 years to actually get the draft of the book together. So from the first day to the end, it was just collecting all these things and trying to see, can this come together as a story? Does this make sense cohesively together? And it was trying to get rid of all those distractions as well, that all the devices that you typically write in, Grammarly and Word and all these things that cause you to go, wait a minute, am I writing this correctly? It was really just trying to get some type of formulative idea down.
And I'll move to Laura. Laura, what was it like to write an academic book? What was it like to say enough is enough? I mean, how do you know enough is enough? What was that whole process like?
So I actually have a couple things to say about that. First of all, for me, I was very fortunate to have a colleague who was teaching software engineering and at that point, human computer interaction. And she immediately realized that most software engineering textbooks were far too difficult for undergraduates. So she had written a software engineering book. Her name is Barbie Teasley, and it was very successful. And so that was sort of my model as what would work with undergrads. And my colleague Julie Barnes and I were teaching our undergrad software engineering classes and also our user experience class, because at that point, our human computer interaction course was required at BGSU. It was a little bit unique. And so every student was coming through this. So we're getting a diverse group of students that were coming through. And we had materials already, and there really were no textbooks. We used some textbooks, we were using some articles and so on. But basically, as instructors, we were sorting through academic articles and turning them into a formulation that would work for undergraduate students. So we had our materials and we started putting them together basically in a written form. And I really, for myself, I never work well by myself. So it was essential for me to have a co-author, and and it was obviously, I think for me and for her, it was a lot more fun too, so that we could compare notes, compare ideas, and so on. And I think our classes kept sort of prototyping our books and seeing how they were going. So that was how we worked.
Oh, that's interesting. Immediate feedback. I didn't think about that when you're teaching. Yes. Thank you. Marty and Spencer, I think you win the prize for 30 years of putting yours together. What was that process like of, again, having 30 years of knowledge and sifting through it and saying, this is the most important things, and let's send this now to bookbinding or whatnot. But what was that process like?
I think the thing that we were lucky with is we already had a syllabus. So we knew what the chapters in the book were going to be, more or less. And so then it was just a process of walking back and forth a lot and thinking, okay, what do I think about this? So clarifying them. Once you get your thoughts clarified, it just flew out. The words flew out and it was easy to write, but figuring out what you thought about each of those things, what your point of view was. And then I think the fact that you knew how long it was going to be taught, a lot of these chapters in the book could be a book unto themselves, but because it was written to support the certification initially, you gave an overview, so you sort of knew when to write. And then we had a deadline. So at the end of 2020, we were going to have to train in over 2 days, 17 professors at SCAD, walk them through the book. And then there was also supporting materials that Spencer can tell you about because he made those. But so we had a hard deadline we had to hit. And fortunately, we have a design team here at Lexington. So I would write a chapter, throw it over the wall, and the design team would design it. And literally, I wrote the last chapter, printed all the other ones out, put them on boards. The last chapter got designed, right? I mean, the paint wasn't even dry on it. And we were teaching 17 professors. But it was really great to do that with that rough draft because they had a lot of questions and they forced us to clarify stuff. And then all of a sudden, the first day of the training, the professor we worked with goes, Marty, you got to tell them what the certification means because we're doing a certification. I'm like, oh yeah, we got a certification. So the 6 key principles in the book are what the certification means. Unfortunately, that just fell right out of my head in like an hour once I was hit with that. It kind of freaked me out at first. So I think really having the time pressure and the syllabus and getting all the feedback during it really helped. But I tell you, it's a great feeling because once you're forced to spend that time clarifying your thoughts, I mean, you see the world differently. And Spencer could tell you he had to do other stuff that he to support it that I would call part of with the videos and things.
Yeah, there's certain techniques and methodologies explained in the book. And the professor told us that their kids learn better if they can watch a video. So we made a video about chapter 10, which is called Insight Translation. And it explains 3 techniques we use and why we use them to help the consumer of research get engaged with it. And then we have a proprietary technique here for understanding the actual physical design of things and what it means to people. We call it sensory cues, and it's about what you see, what you feel, what you hear, what you taste. And but it takes a very specific kind of moderation to get a civilian to talk about the design of something, because they just look at it and it's got a gestalt. They take, and they don't know why it appeals to them. It's a very subconscious thing when you look at something and say, wow, I want that, so we got to have to make that subconscious thing conscious. And it takes a certain moderation technique. And that was what the second video was about. It was about how do you get somebody to talk about a thing and describe the meaning it has for them. And what about that thing triggers that meaning? So it's a very deep sort of digging down with a person to try to get them to articulate that in words, So anyway, this will be 2 videos, and I'm sure we'll make a lot more, but that was the first video.
Well, that's interesting. I was thinking about the book publishing process, and it's rare that once you're done with it, you have to go to an editor. Is that correct? Or how did that work? How did you find your editor? Because there's editors out there that work with children's books. There's editors out there that work with teen. There's editors out there that work with business books. So you really want to find, an editor that understands your topic. So one of you mentioned before, so you're always clear, right? So Marty and Spencer, you talked about, at least you had the feedback of your professors, and Laura, you talked about the feedback from your students. Are you being clear? But what is the process of, okay, once I'm done, now what do I do with what I have? Is it true you went through an editor, and what was that like before you found your publisher? Anyone want to take up the reins on Mark?
More than
Mark's
happy to
ready to
jump
go.
in.
Okay.
Yeah. So funny thing is, I met my editor at a wedding reception. No kidding. Not kidding.
Most
So a
people
friend of
meet their
mine invited
wives.
me. I was with one of his groomsmen, and I was sitting there and I was talking about that I've got to edit my book. It's like, my brother's an editor. Hold on a second. So fascinating thing though is when I already gone through the editing process on the first book, but what I realized was this next round, I need to build a team around me. So we talked about that earlier. So I actually had multiple editors. I had a user experience editor. I had a professional editor. I also had multiple proofreaders. There was an illustrator. There there was a huge team to actually get this second one done, because I said, I'm going to learn what I didn't do the first round. But the first thing the editor on the second book said, this current book, was that I'm going to take everything you wrote and cut it in half. So you wrote all this stuff, we're going to cut it in half, because people don't have attention to read everything. So the book could have been twice as long, but it was actually cut in half. There were sections that were torn out that didn't make sense. But remember, the part of this idea was that it should be for someone that is a beginner. And was fascinating, the editor that I have was actually a web developer. Also was part of his side, one of the things he was trained in as well. So he was trained as a professional writer, but then he ended up, as many of us, we fall into this career. And that's the other interesting thing, is about if you pull anybody that's in user experience, yes, sure, there are programs that currently right now most are going through, but most of us just kind of fell into this and where we want to transition. So it was kind of nice that there was someone that I could vent across and go, well, from your perspective, does this make sense as someone that's entering in the industry? No, I think this needs to be defined more. And then also working with the user experience editor to say, well, actually, technically, we need to say this because that is the technical term. So there was a lot of feedback loop going on, but most of what I wrote was cut in half right up front, which was hard as a writer, but it made sense after you read it that it was definitely more digestible. Just as you were saying earlier about the video, it's you're trying to condense this down to something that is even in a more engaging piece of work.
Well, Marty, yes, isn't it called Kill Your Darlings? Get ready to kill your darlings when you write a book. Marty, Spencer?
Team all the time. So I'm used to it. Somebody told me a long time ago, take what you've written, cut it in half, and then go back and cut it in half again. So since we have to write deliverables for our clients, we're typically Fortune 500 companies, it's got to be concise. And so I think that the way we attacked it was just the way we sort of trained ourselves to write over time, is every word's got to work real hard to be on the page. And then, I think the other thing, the testing with the students, when we got to the publisher, I mean, the funny thing, how it got published was we had a book now, we thought we needed to be published. And every time you look, you don't know who to reach out to or what company. So I just would look at some books, and then I look at everything to get published. You had to fill out a survey. I'm like, I'm not filling out 12 surveys. So one of the principles in the book, the rigorous one, really comes from my undergraduate psychology professor that I studied under, and he had written statistics books. I had the 3rd edition. He's now, I think, the 13th edition. And he'd also written an experimental methods book. So I reached out to him and say, hey, I got a book. What have you learned from writing books? And two key takeaways was, number one, he goes, what I've learned is if people always want to have a competitive book in their portfolio as well. That way, if somebody says, I don't like this book, then the publisher could say, well, what about this book? And he also said, you want to find a publisher that wants to publish your book, that's excited about your book. He said he had a publisher, he had written an experimental methods book, and the publisher wasn't excited by it. And it just sort of died on the vine. So I knew the class that was being taught, we were going to replace the book, 101 Design Methods, by Vijay Kumar. He teaches up at the Institute of Design. So I looked at it, the publisher was Wiley, the editor was Richard Narramore. So I said, I'm not filling out a survey. So I searched all over the internet, found his email address, and said, hey, I got a book. It's adopted by SCAD. It's going to replace your current book. Let me know if you're interested. And we were on the phone with him the next day. And then we sent it to him. We didn't hear from him for a while. And then we thought, well, maybe we should write this other book. We started thinking about outlining this other book we should write instead of this book. And then we're in a meeting in the office, and we get an email, hey, we want to publish your book. And we're like, but we want to write another book. He goes, well, we want to publish this book. Let us do that, and you can always write another book if this one goes well. So it was a strange journey. And then Spencer can tell about the editing, because
I thought it would be a lot. We had we'd written it, we'd tested it with students, we'd rewritten it, so it was pretty refined by the time we got it to Wiley. And the editing really was about punctuation, honest to God. That was most of the stuff. They didn't take much of it out because we had already, as Marty says, gotten it down to where it was as clear and as short as we could make it, and put a lot of pictures in it, to make it engaging. So not a lot of editing at all for our book. But
Laura,
it's
oh,
what
good.
we do for a living, make books. That's what we do for a living. So
Okay. All right. And Laura, what was it like for you for the editing and publishing process? Because I think both before you spoke on finding that publisher that aligns with what your topic is. There are certain publishers out there that only deal with academics, and there's only certain publishers that deal with nonfiction or fiction. But Laura, what was it like for you?
So we had already, we knew we were going to put this book together because, as I said, we were basically teaching the book anyway. And so my co-author and I went to our primary meeting in computer science education. They have a large expo, lots of book publishers are there. We walked around and met up with one of the publishers from Prentice Hall, and she was great. We made a little proposal. One of the things that we really wanted to push for is to keep the price down. And so that was part of our proposal. Was we didn't want a lot of color pictures. We didn't want a lot of fancy, plates or anything that make the cost go up. And so we signed a contract. My brother, who's a lawyer, reviewed the contract. We signed it. And we sent the materials that came back. Basically, Julie and I went through the changes that they made, especially Julie. She was very good at keeping track of those changes. We sent it, they published it. So I think that's a very conventional storyline for academic publishing.
I think the price thing is a really great point you bring up, because when I was talking to my professor that gave me advice that had been publishing books, he said that his statistics book for college students had gone up to $230 for a book because the publisher had been bought by a private equity firm who wanted to, juice the numbers and then flip it and sell it. And I was like, and we didn't know what to price it at. And then the dean at SCAD, he put a price tag on it of $120. And then the publisher put a price tag on it of $35. I was like, that makes a lot more sense.
yeah, for students.
For students, trying to gouge students for books seems a little ruthless.
Mm-hmm. True. Now, and that makes a good point too, but Laura, I want to go back to yours. I wanted to ask, once this goes and it's bound, and it's not like a blog where you can go in and edit or add a sequel or an epilogue or a prequel, what would you add today? What would you update? Would you go through another version of this? Would you go through that process again, or would you just add a chapter or two? And if so, what?
Okay, well, that's a really interesting question because our book has just fallen out of print. And some of my colleagues, especially research colleagues that I work with, we do talk about upgrading the book. Our particular book, basically, we took the approach that no matter what you were doing at every phase in that case, the usability life cycle or whatever you want to call it, that there basically it's an engineering process. So even if you're building an assessment or you're building a design or you're building a user needs or use some kind of problem definition phase, that you're still going through essentially a series of steps. And if you don't pay attention to those steps, chaos erupts. So yes, there are lots of things that I would like to add. One of the things that I was really proud about the book is that we included at the end, it probably was at the end, although we did integrate some of this material earlier, that about inclusion and computer science majors. We did some experiments with computer science majors, and we found that they actually really embraced the ideas of learning how to integrate inclusion in every phase of their work. After the book was published, I did obviously teach the class a number more times at BG, and I taught it at Finley as well. And we tried to add a lot more about inclusion. So I think that is one thing that I would really try to, I don't know, up the ante in terms of the book. But if I was updating, obviously the area of user experience has broadened quite a lot. The basic tenets are still the same though. And so I think the basic steps are still the same. This is sort of my bias, I suppose. And so I think we would like to incorporate more examples of that. For instance, in our book, even when we were talking about problem definition and so on, some of the things that all of you are talking about products and marketing and physical environments, we actually tried to address that. And I think that we could expand on those thoughts and add lots more examples and so on. So yeah, so I think if I worked on it again, and maybe I will, I haven't given up on the idea of doing that.
Good.
Laura, while you're on this topic, someone in the audience asked, what do you mean by inclusion? What's kind of your definition of that?
Okay, well, I hope my definition is inclusive enough, but I worked on, I throughout my career, I worked on, I participated in a conference called Assets, just as an example, which is an accessibility engineering conference. And so when we were thinking about inclusion, we were thinking about making sure that everybody could use and experience what people build. So I guess that's kind of my short answer. And one thing that I think we really understand a lot more about inclusion these days is that when we talk about inclusive environments, we're not really talking about so much about, okay, you have this for this person and that for this somebody else, because most things that we do are socially engaging and we want people to be able to work together. So I think by analogy, here in Wood County, we just had opened our second inclusive playground. And the idea is that kids of all abilities and differences can play together, not so much that you have, this area for this and this area for that. And I think that there's a really strong analog in user experience as well. So that's what we meant by inclusion. At the point that we put it in the book, we basically talked a lot about the laws that provided accessibility, but we tried to promote the idea that that you're stronger if everybody can participate together. So I hope that answered the question. Maybe it didn't, I don't know. Maybe the other authors have thoughts about that as well.
Yeah, I'll just throw one in there, Laura. I mean, I think what's interesting is if you think about the dancing analogy in a wedding reception, there's all ages there. So I've actually even done some wedding or some events. I wouldn't call them wedding receptions, but maybe it's a second marriage. Maybe the demographic is, not the typical demographic that you would think could be at a wedding reception. So maybe then you play some more slow dances. Maybe you play, the waltz or, a cha-cha or something else that you typically wouldn't do. So you're, like you said, you're still approaching the situation, whatever that is, you're designing or you're creating, you're just making sure that there's other ways to access the same information and making sure that when you talk about inclusion, and I love your definition, but it's the idea that no matter what your role is, what you're doing, you should still have equal access to the information that's there. And I think that's what a lot of accessibility is. And if you think about, you do the dance floor analogy, can a wheelchair get there? Are you able to access the dance floor? Is there something in the way? I mean, there's been plenty of places where I've said, no, I'm not going to set up on the carpet because there's a pole in the middle of the room that could lend to somebody getting injured. Why don't we move it this way? So even if you think about the way you're approaching something, you have to think about your audience and how they may interact with it. And that, I think, as long as you have many different, that maybe those would have accommodation needs, or making sure that you're understanding who's in attendance, then or who's using it, who's going to help.
Okay. I'm going to circle back then. Mark, I'm gonna turn to you too, and then I'll save Marty
Okay.
and Spencer, since you're the most recent of publishing. So Mark, you're in the middle of the publishing when you released your book. What would you add to your book today? Is there anything that you would add?
Well, I mean, as I said earlier, the editing process, I cut out about half the content that was in there. So there's more information that can be turned into supplemental information, whether that's possibly some other blog posts or articles. I really think that if you look at a lot of the books that are being released now, there's some interactive component. And we talked about videos earlier. So I really think a lot of it is just translating it into some other way to consume that. So I have been working on an audio version of the book. And then there's also, I know, translations of books in other languages could be helpful. So I think there's things like that. If you have your content and you feel pretty confident of it, I think then making sure then there's other access points. I think the other thing though is making sure that you're in the book that I created, I reference a lot of my resources that were inspired from the content. So I also think that when you're reading something, it's going to spur you to want to read other books as well. So I think if I were to go back now, I think it would be creating the supplemental information, making sure that's available, which I'm working on, and also the audio version, but then also making sure that there are more references that as you're reading it, you could check out and absorb. And I did try to cite many. There probably could have been many more if I were to go through it even deeper.
Okay. And Marty and Spencer, you're the most recent of publishing, and Mark and Marty and Spencer, you also added the supplemental items that you included in your book. So first question I guess I would ask you is, again, is there anything you would add, but you're the most recent of publishing? And then I had a question about how do you upkeep all that supplemental information so it doesn't turn into link or bit rot or what have you. So what do you say?
I think that, as Marty described earlier, this is basically the problem, or the value defining process we use at Lexington to communicate to companies what consumers really want from an experience. We also have a technique for measuring experiences that's not measuring usability, it's measuring the desirability of an experience. And I would have liked to have had that in his book, to put a bow on it. Because once you know all this great stuff, you're going to make something, then you got to have a process for making sure the thing you made lines up with what people asked for in the first place. They ask for something, you make something, you show it to them and ask them if you've delivered what they asked for. It's a very, practical, logical process. But we just didn't put that in the book because they weren't teaching it at SCAD, so they didn't need it. But I guess that's what I would do. I expand the book to talk about how to take what you learned in the first part and test it with consumers in the second part.
Spencer, anything to add?
I was thinking about that question that you asked. I'm thinking there's some stuff I would refine in chapter 1 that I think could be a little clearer. Now that, I've sat there and looked at it, and had to think about it, talk about it, but I guess really, I would want to listen to people that have used it and understand what are their questions. And I would let their questions guide what I would.
He's going to do some research. That's what he.
I mean, it's only been out 8 months, so I've sort of kind of living with a new. I feel like I'm living with a new brain right now, because I've sort of clarified my thoughts, and I'm just getting used to seeing the world differently. So, I just talking to you guys made me realize how fortunate we were to have the school to guide us in all of this. I think that really shaped a lot of it. So I'd listen to them.
Well, that's a great transition. Josh, do we have any questions as we're getting close to the hour? I want to respect time.
All right. Our first question is from Amanda, who is a student, and I'm going to paraphrase your question, Amanda. Hopefully that's okay. So She is, as many students are, building up her portfolio, and she wanted to know what kinds of research and design steps she should highlight in that portfolio that will resonate best with employers.
Well, our point of view on research is you only do it to figure out what your target audience values in an experience. What are the benefits they want, how they want the benefits delivered, and what's the product that's going to deliver benefits. And so that's what I want to see. Anytime I look at a portfolio, how do they crystallize that important piece of information that this is what people want from this experience so that somebody can actually turn around and design something to make it happen. So I want to see that in the portfolio. And I want to see how it ties into the thing they design if they're a designer. A lot of times we see portfolios where they got a bunch of research and they're just paying lip service to research, and then they design something and two things don't match up. So I want to see how those two things match up.
Excellent answer. Mark or Laura, anything to add on this topic?
I'm not sure that I have much to add. One thing I will just mention, since I work less closely with employers than either of the other authors, my students, I always encourage them to put some good writing samples in their portfolio. It has nothing to do necessarily with UX, but that would be my little add in there.
We value writing highly here. Yeah.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is, and it's just kind of retranslating what was said, is it showing the story, understanding that how you got from A to Z, and that it just wasn't something that you went and filled in the blanks to get your end design, that it was part of the process, that it gave you an insight to make an adjustment, or it provided you information that helped you come to your final outcome.
Excellent. All right, a question from Ramat. Hearkening back to our talk on inclusion, he wanted to know, is there a book or website that talks about UX research or design for seniors? Putting you guys on the spot a little bit, but maybe you know some off the top of your head. I do, if anyone else doesn't mention it.
Well, I think that there is NSF about 10 years ago, actually, because I was there, had a workshop about that question and did publish, it'd be free. You just have to figure out where it is. Did publish an article where they brought, it was kind of like a little handbook where they brought a number of, in that case, they were, HCI UX professors. And we brought in a number of experts about aging and kind of tried to develop some guidelines as well. So that would be my pointer, although I think it would be work to find it.
NSF being the National Science Foundation.
Yes.
The book I was thinking of is from Jeff Johnson, who you might know for Designing with the Mind in Mind, which is a great book. He also has a book from a few years ago called Designing User Interfaces for an Aging Population. But he's not from Ohio, so we didn't invite him to this panel. What are some of your favorite resources, Mark?
I think there's a lot out there. I mean, if you look up, you've got Nielsen Norman has a lot out there, Human Factors International. There's also, I know there's a lot of resources out there that are on the Accessibility Association. So if you look those up, but what I think is fascinating though, that makes me think about this question, and please forgive me, which is a Bryan Adams song. Sorry to bring the DJ thing in, but it's, if you think about it, if you're being inclusive and you're following the UCD process, user-centered design process, then designing for seniors should be definitely one of those audiences that you're going to hit as part of that. So if you're following the best practices, if you're thinking about making sure, we talked about inclusion, you're including those with accommodation needs within your test plan, or however, whatever your verbatim is at your organization, then you will be including that, you will be thinking about that. And then also, if you're focusing on a specific audience, you may be alienating another. So I think it's just, if you think about it holistically, yes, definitely you should consider a specific demographic, because there are stats out there that say, I think it's 2035, that those over the age of 65 is going to outnumber youths. That we already know this is coming. So definitely a very smart question. However, my belief is that if you follow the standard practices and making sure you're including those with accommodation needs, you should be covered.
Excellent. All right, last question is from Brandon, and I think this touches on something we're all aware of. In the era of Medium.com articles and social media in general, how does someone make themselves an author and share knowledge on emerging UX areas and practices? So if someone wants to follow in your footsteps and write a book and not just a Medium.com blog post, how would you recommend they do that?
Work with students.
I would also add that for me, there are hundreds of books out there about user experience. So also think about, what's unique about what you're presenting. And definitely if you're going to work with students or your end audience, but is it something that will, resonate with them? And I think that was part of the challenge, where for me, I just don't want to create something that there's already something out there that exists. So maybe that's just me, but it was always a challenge where you want to make something that can resonate.
I would just say it too is like, again, I know only about teaching, but when you're teaching, you're telling a story. And kind of follow up on what Marc is saying, if your story is unique and has value to it, then that probably tells you that you have a book maybe in your future.
Great advice. All right. Those were the questions in our queue. So I will hand it back over to Jen. You're muted.
Thank
Gotta
you.
happen one time every webinar.
I was so close to making it to the end and not doing that. All right, we're going to be respectful of time. And Keith, I'm going to turn this last slide over to you so we could wrap this up. And again, I appreciate our authors for being here, for writing, for representing Ohio. As a librarian, I appreciate the process. It's a tough one to write. It's a tough one to get published, as Brandon is I think alluding to. How do you even start that? But I appreciate that, and I will send this over to Keith.
Yeah, again, thanks to the authors for participating. Thanks for our UX Akron for working with us at Ohio X. Again, we're just trying to build a community of user experience practitioners and professionals and other people interested in user experience across Ohio. Here's some other things that Ohio X does. We talked about DEI, but they're starting a roundtable for that. I was in Cincinnati last night at a happy hour, hanging out with other tech folks, and I met five user experience colleagues at this event. So we're showing up and participating in across Ohio as part of the tech community. So again, thank you for joining us, and look for some more things from Ohio X.
And I will, once the recording is here, I will bundle that out and get that out so that others, you can rewatch it. And we could pass this along to others. So thank you. And everyone have a fabulous Friday and a fabulous weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Thanks
having
again.
us.
Thank you.
Bye.